Okay, welcome again, everyone, to the webinar series. And hopefully you can now see the icon and choose the language which you would like to experience the webinar in. This, like our previous webinars, will be recorded and uploaded onto our website at R2R Birds. We've just completed, I want to mention this because it's important to us, that we just completed our first in-person workshop a couple of weeks ago at the National Conservation and Training Center. It was entitled The Sustainable Recovery of North American Birds. And I suspect many of you have attended that in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. We had 150 in-person participants, and many more attended the keynote and panel discussions virtually. The themes were supporting the development of species working groups, integrating biological and social science using co-production model, fostering partnerships for recovery. We even had partnerscapes join us coincidentally at NCTC, and we took advantage of the private landowners' attendance there. Another theme was developing and implementing diverse and inclusive international partnerships. And another theme, developing analytical tools to identify and prioritize limiting factors in the context of incomplete information. I hope you enjoyed it if you attended it. And if you did not, the keynote presentations and the panel discussions were videoed and recorded and are listed and available on our website. We're developing more resources for the species working groups and reformatting our website so that those resources are more readily available to the species working groups. And in the near future, you can look for a Facebook page that will enhance our communications as well. As I mentioned earlier, we have over 200 people registered for today's presentation, and we're really looking forward to it. Now let me introduce Quinn Carvey, who is our graduate fellow for the Road to Recovery, and she will introduce our presenters and facilitate the questions and answers after the presentation. Quinn?
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Belinda, for offering this translation. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, who will be giving a talk about the Cerulean Warbler. Our first speaker is Elizabeth Hunter, who is an assistant unit leader for the USGS Virginia Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at Virginia Tech. Her research program focuses on developing management strategies for at-risk species in the face of global change, with a primary taxonomic focus on birds and reptiles. For bird projects, she is currently working on understanding the risk of sea level rise to salt marsh sparrows in Virginia, developing tools for multi-species management in pine savanna habitats in the southeastern US, and developing a full annual cycle population model for Cerulean Warblers. Our second speaker today is Randy Dettmers, who is a senior biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Migratory Bird Program in the Northeast region and serves as the chair of the Eastern Working Group of Partners in Flight. He focuses on the conservation of migratory land birds through collaborations with species working groups and conservation partners working to develop and implement conservation strategies for birds of conservation concern. Randy has been a member of the Cerulean Warbler Technical Group since its inception in 2001, and early in his career enjoyed helping finding Cerulean Warbler nests in Ohio, Tennessee, and West Virginia to support research on factors affecting the species' abundance and productivity. So thank you, Elizabeth and Randy, and I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Quinn. I'm actually going to start out, and it's a pleasure to be here today with everyone. I'm actually standing in for Todd Fear, who is the current chair of the Cerulean Warbler Technical Group, but he had a conflict today, and so he asked me if I would give this kind of introduction to the Cerulean Warbler Technical Group. And I'm going to try and whip through about 20 years of history of this group, highlighting some of the successes and challenges it has experienced over that time. And I know that there are folks on here who have been part of the group for probably much of that time. And so I apologize in advance if I miss any significant happenings or in any inaccuracies that have crept into my presentation. But the Cerulean Warbler Technical Group formed in 2001, in part because of a petition to list the species as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in the United States in 2000. Of forming this group was a desire to demonstrate that collaborative science-based conservation can be an alternative to regulatory action. And the choice of the group's name was intentional, signaling that this was not an advocacy group of any kind, but a science-based group looking for collaborative solutions among a variety of communities that intersect with a steeply declining bird. It included biologists and managers from government agencies, non-government organizations, academia, and industry. It initially formed in the United States, but quickly grew to include international participation from Canada and South America and Central America. Over the coming years, there were several Cerulean Warbler summits held to bring group members together to share information and work on plans and proposals for research to fill information gaps and conservation implementation projects to address threats. The first summit was held in 2002, and at that meeting, the group formed a steering committee to help organize the functions of the working group, and also subcommittees for both the breeding and non-breeding ranges, organized around themes such as research and monitoring, as well as topic-related conservation actions such as addressing forest management, coal mining, and coffee production. The members of the non-breeding committee organized into what they referred to themselves as El Grupo Ceruleo. In 2004, the Cerulean Warbler Conservation Initiative was launched with funding from several major sources, including the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the Tropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act, the U.S. Forest Service International Program, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And this propelled work to better understand the current status of the species and foster greater participants and cooperation between industries and various government agencies that influenced the lands where the species spent the different parts of its annual cycle. The forest products, coal, and coffee industries were key partners at this time. They supported and engaged with the Cerulean Warbler Technical Group in developing management guidelines for these different industries and providing access to their lands for survey and research projects. The decision on whether or not to list the Cerulean Warbler occurred in 2006, and this group contributed significantly to the status assessment for the species. And ultimately, the decision was made that Cerulean Warbler did not warrant listing as a threatened species at that point in time. Next slide, please. So the second Cerulean Warbler Summit was held in early 2007, shortly after that listing decision. The purpose of that meeting turned into laying the groundwork for a conservation strategy for the species and resulted in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Focal Species Conservation Plan, which was a fairly high-level but full annual cycle assessment of status, threats, and conservation actions needed for the species, along with assessments of funding needs to implement those actions. At the end of that meeting, attendees from Colombia invited the group to have its next meeting in South America. So in the fall of 2008, the group met jointly with the Golden-winged Warbler Working Group in Colombia. Participants from across the countries of the wintering ranges of these two species, Cerulean Warblers and Golden-winged Warblers, attended that meeting along with about 20 North Americans. The meeting was held at the headquarters of the National Coffee Federation of Colombia in Bogota, and it was followed by a field trip to a newly minted Cerulean Warbler Reserve that was established through the American Bird Conservancy. And that meeting led to the development of a comprehensive Cerulean Warbler non-breeding conservation plan and the concept of something we came to call the 3 C's connection, the coal, coffee, Cerulean Warbler connection, with the intention of linking coffee and coal industries in the interests of Cerulean Warbler conservation and human well-being for the people living and working in the range of this species in both North and South America. Not long after the Columbia meeting, the group secured funding from multiple sources to undertake a large-scale collaborative research project to assess responses of Cerulean warblers to various forest management treatments across their breeding range. Involving multiple researchers at numerous study sites, the results from that project were turned into the forest management guidelines that are now widely used to communicate the forest conditions and Cerulean warbler-friendly forest management practices in use today. Next slide. In 2013, the Cerulean Warbler Technical Group, along with the Golden Wing Warbler Working Group again, were key participants in the Partners in Flight 5th International Conference that focused on full annual cycle conservation, and where the idea of linking key geographies between breeding and wintering ranges of land birds through conservation business plans was initiated. After numerous fits and starts over the past 10 years, such a plan for the mid-elevation forests of Central and South America has finally been completed. From about 2015 to 2020, the Cerulean Warbler Technical Group lapsed into a period of inactivity in terms of regular meetings, due in part to factors such as retirements of some of the people who had been in leadership positions, a reduction in available funding, and significant changes in the coal and coffee markets that resulted in disengagement from those industry groups. However, Cerulean Warbler work in terms of research and conservation implementation continued on from the members who had been participating in this group during this period. Important research on fledgling survival and habitat selection, as well as migratory connectivity and stopover ecology, was carried out. Forest management implementation based on the 2013 guidelines was carried out through joint ventures and various agencies and organizations interested in creating more suitable breeding habitat for the species. The group was revived in 2021 under the leadership of Todd Fear, who has organized regular meetings for the group since then, beginning with informational presentations on current Cerulean Warbler projects and activities, and moving toward discussing what the group would like to focus on heading into the future. The group currently is not as highly structured as it once was, but more defined structure will likely come after identifying priority activities the group would like to focus on. In mirroring the Road to Recovery guidance, the group has prioritized identifying limiting factors and filling demographic knowledge gaps as immediate needs to further help target conservation action where it will have the greatest impact for the species. This led to developing a proposal and securing funds through the joint U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and U.S. Geological Society Service Science Support Program to gather existing data and identify data gaps for building a full annual cycle model. And so I'm now going to turn it over to Elizabeth to tell you more about this exciting project.
Wonderful. Thank you, Randy. That was really helpful for me, actually, too, as I'm sure it was for many other folks in the audience. As Randy mentioned, I am very new to the Cerulean Warbler Technical Group, as I was brought on for this project. And so I have really benefited from learning from all of the folks in the group who have much more experience with this species. And so I'm going to talk about this project that we're getting started. And just to start with that, I'm going to introduce our project team, which is, Randy Dettmers is the Fish and Wildlife Service project lead. And then Lainey Metz is a PhD student working with me here at Virginia Tech, doing the modeling component that I'll talk more about. Todd Fear, as you heard, is the technical committee coordinator. Don Bobes and his master student, Jacob Miranda, are Arkansas State, and they're doing breeding season field work. Dan Derbyshire and Brendan Boyd with Birds Canada are also doing breeding season field work. Paul Hess and Linda Ziemba at two Fish and Wildlife Service refuges in New York are doing breeding season field work. And then Nick Bailey at Selva in Colombia is doing winter season field work. Sarah Kendrick has provided a lot of expertise and logistical support. And then Wayne Thogmartin with USGS has been very helpful in that they have been working on a golden wing warbler modeling study that is very similar to what we're proposing, but they're a couple of years ahead of us. And so I was very interested to learn that the golden wing connection with ceruleans goes back to the 2008 joint meeting. So we are continuing to learn from that group, and I'm going to be talking throughout the rest of today about some of the lessons learned from them and how we're kind of moving forward from those lessons. So we are less than a year into this 3-year project. So I'm mostly going to be talking about our project objectives and then where we are with them, as we are still very initial stages. So our first objective is to develop the structure of a full annual cycle population model that would ultimately identify the demographic parameters driving trends within identified populations. So a lot of different components there. Full annual cycle population model, I put the map in the bottom left there to remind us that we're talking about both breeding and wintering ranges and the stopovers between them as best we can. And there is a data skew towards the breeding range, and I will slip into that, but we are going to try to integrate as much from the rest of the full annual cycle as we can. And then the demographic trends that we're seeing are largely driven from 2 different data sources, eBird, which is the map in the top right, showing declines in the red dots throughout the species range, and then the breeding bird survey at the bottom, that aggregate trend line declining down over the last several decades. So we want to know why are these declines occurring, and are they different in different parts of the species range? Is there a different reason? Is it due to productivity in some places or due to certain survival stages in other places? So our first step here is with identifying those populations. And to do that, we took an approach that was described by Clark Rushing and others a few years ago. They did this for wood thrush and a few other species, where they used data from breeding bird survey from abundances and trends to delineate what they call natural populations. So these are not genetically delineated populations, but populations that would be experiencing similar stressors such that you would expect them to have similar abundances and trends. And you can see the delineated populations for wood thrush in that map there. So Lainey Metz, PhD student on this project, took that approach with cerulean data for the breeding grounds. And you can see there's far fewer points on that map than for wood thrush. There's just very few BBS routes that have sufficient data to do this process. But you can see delineated populations there. However, another piece of information that is used to create these delineations is just the geographic closeness of the BBS routes. And if you just run the model with just that geographic information and not any of the actual abundance and trend information, you get the exact same delineation. And that could be from a couple of different reasons. It could be that it's just that there's really strong geographic patterning of abundances and trends, or it could be that there's not sufficient information coming from the BBS data to overcome just the geographic information. And it's not really clear at this point without additional data sets which one of those things it is. But I'll now show you some lessons from the golden wing folks that maybe it doesn't matter that much that we aren't able to delineate these populations with that much certainty. So lessons from Golden Wing Warbler. They went through the same process where they used this Clark rushing procedure to delineate populations. And they used not only breeding bird survey data, but also survey data that was designed to target golden wing warblers. So a lot more data, especially in the Appalachian region, which is where those surveys were conducted. So they did this process and they did see delineation that was driven by the data on abundance and trends. However, they decided to forego those delineated populations and aggregate to just 2 areas anyway. So they did their modeling just when lumping everything in the Appalachians together and everything in this kind of upper Great Lakes region. And this is because of sparseness in the demographic data sets to build one of these integrated population models. So I'm going to get into that a little bit more now. So our goal is to develop this integrated population model, and the diagram on the right there gives you an example of what one of these could look like, but they could vary somewhat, but this is the general idea, is that you have a count data set as serving as the background to tell you about the trends, you're estimating abundance and trends over time, that end there in the middle. And then you are getting more precision on, well, why is that end changing over time by integrating these other data sets. So you have something like a nest survival data set to give you information about productivity and estimate fecundity, that F. And then on the right, you have a capture-recapture data set to allow you to estimate potentially age-specific and sex-specific survival. We would want to do this because then we can address the question of why are different populations declining through identifying these very specific parameters that you can't estimate very well through other means. Modeling in this way also allows for increased precision of things like fecundity and survival. And in some cases, it allows you the ability to estimate unmeasured demographic variables. Sometimes. So sometimes you could just have the count data and the market capture data, but still estimate fecundity even though you don't have a nest survival data set. But in those cases, you really need a lot of data in the other 2 kind of realms. In order to build these kinds of models, you need multiple data sets that overlap both spatially and temporally you need many years of data. So we have started gathering data to build IPMs. We sent out a data request in August. Some of you might have received that data request, and thank you very much to everyone who has and will send us data. This map shows some of the data sets that we have received and that we expect to receive, and actually there are more points now as we've been bothering people more for data. We expect to receive at least 15 point count data sets, and these vary from being point counts that were conducted at, say, a single refuge for a couple of years to point counts that were conducted across many different Forest Service national forests. So they vary quite a lot in size. And we expect to receive 8 to 10 nest productivity data sets that also vary in how many years data were collected, and 6 to 8 marker capture data sets. So this is great. And we, again, are very grateful to everyone who has sent us data. But it's substantially less than what the Golden Wing Warbler folks had in hand when they started building their IPMs. For instance, they had over 20 marker capture data sets. So just keeping in mind kind of the relative quantity of data for these 2 different efforts. So some lessons from the Golden Wing efforts. Despite having much more data than we will, even if we receive more, I don't think we'll get to the Golden Wing level. This was not enough to overcome a mismatch between the count and the demographic data sets. This is because the count data, especially BBS, was collected somewhat randomly. Obviously, the locations are not random, but they're not placed in with regard to where golden wing warblers have high or low density. So you should be collecting a full range of density information with account data. However, as anyone who has ever tried to find a nest or capture a bird knows, you want to do that where you have high densities. So demographic data were collected where abundances are high, and that makes total sense. I do fieldwork too, so I understand why. You don't want to spend a ton of time where, looking for a nest where you only have one pair. But that means that we're not able to link together that demographic data to the count data very well. They're not providing information about the same population necessarily. So this mismatch, combined with the fact that they aggregated data sets across these wide areas, the entire Appalachians and the entire Great Lakes region, led to very high uncertainty in the estimates of those demographic rates from the IPM, such that it was hard to make inferences from those outcomes. And I applaud all of their efforts with this, and this was our exact same plan for how we were going to move forward. Given that outcome, and that we will never have as much data as they did, there's really no need for us to further follow in their footsteps. We can learn from their experience and try to take a little different tack so that we can get as much from the data that we are receiving as we can. And we're lucky in that we do have some data sets that have all three components, that count data set, the productivity data set, and the marker capture data set, all in the same location, collected at the same time. And I don't think the Golden Wing folks had any data sets like that. And what this allows us to do is to shift our spatial scale of analysis. Instead of trying to look across really big populations or half of the range or anything like that, we're just going to focus in on those smaller sites. And I've circled one site like this in Indiana, where Kamal Islam and his group have been working for many years and very generously have allowed us to use their data. So that's an example of one of these sites. So we can analyze these sites separately and incorporate covariates like climate covariates, habitat covariates, to understand which other locations could have similar conditions and therefore be experiencing similar responses of those demographic parameters to those changes in condition. So we very recently have kind of shifted our aims here. So I don't have anything further to tell you other than that's our plan from now on. And we're still gathering data and processing it to get ready to mod. But we knew at the beginning of this project that we would be unlikely to be able to fully parameterize an IPM throughout the range. We put that in our project proposal. So our second objective is to identify these population-specific data gaps in the Cerulean Warbler demographic rates across the full annual cycle, which will come about through the data gathering and analysis process, but we already have a good guess at what some of those demographic rates are that are missing. So that leads to our third objective, which is to gain new information on habitat-dependent overwinter survival in the Andes, and breeding season, female ecology, and demography to help fill these two known critical information gaps. So fieldwork has already been ongoing. Nick Bailey and his group at Salva started collecting data last winter. They deployed 32 MODIS tags on male and female Cerulean Warblers in Colombia and are doing another 32 tags this year, right now. And then in the breeding season last summer, folks in Arkansas, New York, and Ontario deployed 19 MODIS tags. And the goal there was to just get females, and the photos at the bottom are some of the very happy captures of females. But if any of you have tried to do this before, it's apparently extremely challenging. So not all of those 19 MODIS tags were put on females, but we're doing another field season this year and really hope to get more information on those females. And of course, the gaps that remain in data collection are the hardest ones to do, right? So we are just grateful for whatever data we can get on these missing components. So I do want to show you some results that Nick put together from last winter. This is on the y-axis, different individuals that were tagged in the winter in Colombia. And the x-axis is time starting in November going to April. And the individuals that are on the top in that green bar area, they survived the entire winter and then departed on migration in March. And the individuals at the bottom at yellow likely departed after arriving at their field sites early in the winter. So it seems like there's some site selection going on early in the winter. And then the individuals in the middle showed signal strength differences that indicated that they likely died in the early winter. And so from this information, we can get estimates of overwintering survival, which is a component that has been fairly lacking in our understanding so far. So goal here is to then incorporate this wintering information into a full annual cycle model. So there is still some uncertainty on connectivity between breeding and wintering sites. We do have Doug Raybuck's great work on using geolocators, but there wasn't, complete separation of where individuals went from breeding to wintering and vice versa. So we will do some sensitivity testing to see how much it matters, how we match up breeding and wintering grounds. And that leads me to our last objective here, which is to conduct a sensitivity analysis once we have a larger model built that will allow us to prioritize future data collection on demographic parameters that exert the greatest influence on population growth rates. So this will allow us to answer some questions of what regions do we have the most uncertainty about? So where do we need to collect more demographic data? What types of fieldwork do we need to be doing? Right now, we're spending a lot of effort trying to get information on breeding season female survival, but is that what the populations are most sensitive to? Or is it really, we need to know about all sexes over fall migration survival? What is the type of fieldwork we need to be doing the most? And then ultimately, we want to connect to on-the-ground management. If we can identify those weak links in the full annual cycle, then that will tell us, do we need to really focus on the breeding grounds, or is it stopovers or wintering sites? So we have still a lot of work ahead of us. As I mentioned, we're still early on in this project. We are very happy to receive more data. Would love to hear about anything that you know of. And we can share more details about the data sets that we have received. If you're curious, I've put my email address there, and Lainey Metz, the graduate student on this project. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have leads for us or have questions about the project. So I'm sure Randy and I would be happy to take any questions at this point.
Great. Thank you so much for a really interesting presentation on such an amazing bird. We are opening up the floor to questions. We can take questions by raising your hand through audio and video. You can also post your questions in the chat. We do already have some interest from Angie in the chat about starting a MODIS tagging effort in Ecuador. So I don't know if you want to comment on that at all before we have some questions come in.
Good question, and I'm not sure if I am the person to answer it. In terms of starting up a MODIS tagging effort, so we were lucky in that Nick Bailey with Selva already had some infrastructure to do some MODIS work, and we, in the early processes of figuring out the scope of this project, relied heavily on Sarah Kendrick, was able to get some funding from Fish and Wildlife Service to get them going. So this project has relied a lot on cooperator input. So we have gotten money through this science support program. But Nick basically did that first field season effort I'm not even sure how they got the funds to do it. Maybe Sarah can provide some more info there. Sarah, do you want to jump in?
I'll just chime in very briefly. So it was kind of a neat grassroots effort where we got local Audubon chapters and birding groups in the state of Missouri to donate funds to pay for Selva's time to do the field work. The Fish and Wildlife Service, our unit in migratory birds, provided the funding for the 30 tags to deploy on ceruleans. And then, of course, Selva did all the hard work on the ground, just because Nick and I have worked together on past projects, and he's awesome and Selva's amazing and always willing to do work like that. So it was a really cool effort of 3 or 4 different groups pooling money to do that first year. And then that made it really easy for us to fold the second year of that project, because we'd shown that proof of concept, we could get it done for that year too. So the grant that we all got together through the Cerulean Warbler Species Working Group Technical Group helped pay for that second year of field work, and that's providing new information to science for the species, which is very exciting. And so I don't know if Nick wants to chime in with anything. I don't want to put him on the spot either, but that work has been really fun and insightful and just a really cool project to work on with lots of different moving parts.
Yeah, Nick, go ahead.
I don't think I need to add anything. Aside saying that, I mean, yes, it would be fantastic to have demographic information from elsewhere in the non-breeding range. And Ecuador would certainly be very high on the list, as it holds a significant part of the non-breeding population of Cerulean Warblers. And it is relatively, I mean, the eastern slope of the Andes in Ecuador is relatively geographically isolated from the sites we're working, so certainly would lend more information. But yeah, it's always the same problem of a question of funds and getting the equipment and tags and so on. And just, to give people a bit of a sense, to get the kind of level of information we're getting on these individual birds, we're setting up 2 to 3 motor stations at each individual site we're working at. So you really, these are birds in mountainous terrain. You need multiple stations with different antennas trying to cover all the different angles, so you can kind of get this constant information from the birds on a daily basis.
Nick, how could we connect with somebody? We are currently in the process of acquiring funding for 1 Motus tower in Sumaco, Ecuador. We're working with some partners in the area. It's a community tourism project that I'm consulting with. We're also in contact with Wild Sumaco. We had thought 1 Motus tower was sufficient, but from what I'm hearing, you're suggesting more than 1 Motus tower. How do we need to get that information before we start fundraising so that we can be fundraising for the right amount of towers? How do we get started in this process and coordinate with people who know what's going on so that we're starting off on the right foot?
So it really just boils down to what you're hoping to obtain with the Motus infrastructure. So normally most projects, they're it's all about just detecting birds, actively migrating, so 1 station is sufficient. But when you're actually tagging birds at a local site and you're interested in getting information on them throughout a breeding season or a non-breeding season, for example, that's when you need more than 1 station in order to be able to cover, the terrain. Because the typical motor stations aren't designed to track birds on the ground. They're designed to track birds actively migrating, flying through the airspace over the station. So when you go to these kind of different projects where the goal is kind of different from the wider Motus network, that's when you really need to be thinking about, if I catch a bird here, is it in view of my antenna or not? And then you realize that, no, I actually need multiple stations at my 1 site to cover everything. So it really depends on what your goals are and, what your site looks like. Some sites you can cover them fairly well with 1 station, others you will need multiple stations if your intention is really to be able to follow birds within your study area, let's say, and not beyond.
Okay, I don't want to take over this conversation. I'm going to pop my email address in the chat. And if anybody has any ideas for us and how to move forward, I would really appreciate if people could reach out. And thank you. Thank you so much. I understand it a little bit better now.
Great, thanks for that question. Facilitate a great conversation. We have another question asking, what is the estimated timeline for reaching the ultimate goal of connecting to on-the-ground management?
Great question. I think it's not necessarily within the time frame of this project in the next 2 years necessarily, because we don't know yet what the driving demographic rates are, the limiting demographic rates. So it might be straightforward in what the management is. If I'm gonna totally bungle what the most straightforward thing would be, but if it's productivity is always the limiting factor in every population, then that might be a little bit more straightforward than, you know, fall migration, where we still have to figure out where are the stopover sites always, and if they vary from year to year and things like that. So that might be a harder thing to figure out. Okay, now what do we do? You know, that will take more data collection, perhaps. I don't know, Randy, if you want to add anything else to that.
No, that's pretty much what I was going to say too. You know, if we hope that after the next couple of years on this project, we have a better sense of where those demographic limiting factors are. But then it really kind of depends on which ones they are, what time of year they're happening, and how much information we already have about the species during those periods. And if it's something that we still don't have a lot of information, then we're going to have to go back and try and, you know, collect the appropriate data to inform what's going to happen. So, but anyway, I think it's going to be at least, you know, probably 3 to 5 years before any of that happens at best.
Great, and we have another question. There has been a fair amount of forest management done in the Appalachians following the Cerulean Warbler BMPs, which I'm not sure what the acronym means, but do you know whether that management has had a positive effect?
Randy, you want to take that one? Yeah.
Tom, you're pitching, you know, challenging questions, of course. We have some indications that within parts of the breeding range, it looks like the population trajectories have sort of at least leveled out, if not maybe reversed a bit. But trying to tie those specifically to the habitat management that's already been done is a challenge that I think we're just embarking on now. So we don't have any clear answers to that. We're hopeful that the work that has been done has been having positive effects, but we really need to dig into that more to fully understand the really extent of how much of those BMPs have really been put on the ground and where, and then try and match that up as best we can with the survey monitoring data that is out there. So that is a project that I think there's a lot of interest in doing, and one that we're going to try and undertake, but we don't have the clearest answers yet.
Great, and thank you to the people in the chat for letting us know that BMP is best or beneficial management practices. We have another question that asks if it's an accurate statement to say that we still need a lot more basic information on habitat use, stopover duration, survival, and etc. during the migratory period.
I'm going to say yes. We have not been able to acquire too much information on migratory periods. And, you know, we're going to have to infer, you know, what happens between breeding and wintering. Well, that's fall migration, and then, you know, vice versa. But yeah, I think that component is still very early stages. So, Randy, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, definitely. Absolutely. You know, there over the last 20-ish years, there have been various efforts to try and understand where, particularly in Central America, some of the key stopover sites are, and some of the work that Nick has been doing recently to really kind of understand how the birds are using some of those places is gathering us some information to at least, you know, base additional, I think, questions and try and understand those more. But we are a long way from fully understanding all those parameters during migration.
Yeah, and I think part of this project, I mean, there's a good chance that we'll find that fall or spring migration is the limiting factor. And I think that would just provide more impetus to focus data collection in those areas where possible.
And we have a request in the chat for Nick to comment on neotropical flyways project monitoring during migration.
Sorry, Nick. That was I just think it's so fascinating. It's probably the largest scale effort surveying them on migration.
Here was I thinking I was going to have a relaxing lunchtime listening to someone else
Sorry.
talk. So yeah, if for those who haven't heard about this initiative yet, there's a project called the Neotropical Flyways Project, which has been largely led by Selva on the ground, but is a large partnership of a bunch of different organizations from across North America and also multiple organizations along the flyway that we're studying that basically runs from Northern Colombia through Central America, covering 8 different countries. And so what we've been doing is carrying out a standardized survey protocol during both fall and spring migration that is essentially we're repeating a bunch of different sites that we set up every 10 days. So we're actually kind of being able to track what's happening throughout the migration period rather than, just kind of focusing on one period and starting to get a sense of where species like Cerulean Warblers and among others are actually stopping over, which is obviously, always been really difficult just because the amount of data you get on these birds on migration, because they're so dispersed through these landscapes is often minimal. And the time they're actually passing through these areas can be, a case of a week or maybe 2 weeks. And so for Ceruleans, we've learned a bit. We haven't learned anywhere near enough, as I think Randy hinted at. Certainly, there are areas that are lighting up as we run occupancy models with these data, and one of those areas in particular is kind of the Caribbean slope of Costa Rica, and also the most western extent of Panama. And we haven't crunched the data yet for Nicaragua and Honduras and parts of Guatemala. We suspect will probably be also very important. At least in fall and partly in spring. So, yeah.
Great, and we still have some time for questions if people want to continue to put in the chat or raise your hand. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about maintaining a working group over time, identifying partners. You've got these large geographic ranges and also some multidisciplinary questions, I guess, with management. So I'm curious if you could just kind of talk a bit more about some of those topics.
Yeah, I think this group has been, has really thought about that quite a bit over the period of its existence, recognizing that we want to both provide the best scientific information that we can to inform what happens in terms of conservation for the species, but acknowledging that, that the species, as you said, has wide geographic range across, several continents, and that it also overlaps with various interests of different people and communities and industries and things like that. So we have been, tried to think about that quite a bit. And as I said early on, the engagement with industries like the forest products industry and coal mining and coffee was very intentional. And I think we made, a good effort to reach out to people involved in those industries and kind of explain our interests and how they could overlap with their interests, and invited them to be part of the conversation. and really listen to them as well. I know, like, with coal mining, you wouldn't necessarily think there was like a lot of overlap, but we had some really great meetings with representatives from the coal mining industry over time. And, the coffee industry was a really strong partner for a period of time. So there's a lot of interest in trying to figure out how, and I think people in general are interested in figuring out how, these important industries in different places can be, still be good stewards of biodiversity on their lands. So looking for, those kinds of interactions and engagements with the people and the sociologic interests of people in the different areas that overlap with the species range is really important. And we've tried to do that over time, sometimes more successfully than others. But I think as this group kind of gets back to really thinking about some of these issues again, that will be an important part of what we continue to try and do.
Great, thank you so much. I guess final call for questions from the audience. Okay, we've got one. So for your MODIS tag survival estimates, how did you determine which birds had died in early winter versus birds that had departed early in winter? What confidence is there that the early departure birds weren't also mortalities that were carried out of MODIS range?
Hey, I have a slide of Nick's that maybe he wants to talk us through. What do you think, Nick?
Sure, get it up.
How's that?
I'm glad you put that one. Yeah. So this is the genius of using MODIS, and this is why we used it for this project, is that it's, I think, one of the few methods when you're trying to measure these demographic patterns where you can actually differentiate between emigration and what is a mortality event. So this is the really fantastic part. So anybody who's worked with MODIS will know that when birds depart a site, there's a fairly strong departure signal that you see on the antennas. So as birds take off, the signal strength tends to go up, i.e. the signal reaches the antennas on your motor station better because it's not having to wind its way through trees, mountains, and everything else. So you see a spike in signal strength, and then as the bird flies away and moves away from the site, you see a decrease in signal strength. So you have this fairly clear signal. Now, some of you may be asking, but what happens if, I don't know, got caught by a raptor and the raptor flew off? Wouldn't you see the same thing? Well, yes, you probably would, but would that occur at 7 o'clock in the evening, an hour after sunset? Probably not. So you have this second element that we know that most migratory departures occur just after sunset. There's been a recent paper that showed how heavily synchronized these are. So combining the two, when you zoom in on these data, which is what you're seeing in these graphs here, you can actually differentiate between what would have been a migratory departure because it's at an appropriate time of day, and you see this change in signal strength, versus what would be more likely to be a predation event. So in these three graphs, just to walk you through them very quickly, you've got signal strength on the y-axis and then time on the x-axis. And for each panel here, there's two different motor stations being shown. So you're kind of seeing the signal strength on the different ones. And when birds are active and alive, the signal strength moves up and down a lot, right? The birds are turning around, they're moving through the forest. So your signal strength is varying constantly. And that's, you get this very clear patterns of activity versus non-activity. So in the second panel there, you can see these kind of daily peaks in activity and not much happening at night. And so what you're seeing in the first one was a bird that actually departed in early December. And if we actually zoomed in on that last day, you'd see that departure signal. But what was cool about this bird is it disappeared. So obviously moved out of range of our antennas, but reappeared. You can see a little spike right at the end there, kind of in late March, which is exactly when everybody else started migrating, the birds that stayed on site. So that was a pretty good example of where a bird moved away from the original, or the site where we actually tagged it, but then flew back past or came close to that site when it started migrating. And then the second example is just of a bird that survived all the way through till it migrated in mid-March. And then the third one is an example of where it's a mortality event. So when that signal kind of died in December, it wasn't early in the evening, it wasn't linked to a departure signal. And we kind of lost sight of that tag for a while, as you can see. And then the tag reappears in January, but with this very low constant signal, which is kind of suggesting that, you know, that this isn't a tag on a live moving bird. And when we saw this in the data, we got our team to go out and look for it. They found the tag together with a color band and a metal band and nothing else. So if this was a case that the tag had dropped off and the bird had lost it, obviously you wouldn't find it together with its respective bands. So it was a very clear case of, you know, this bird died, whether it was actually a predation event or something else happened. We don't know, but the fact that, you know, the three things were found together is pretty strong evidence that it was a predation event. So this is why, you know, we just think it's just awesome being able to use Motus to get at these kind of questions now, because you can actually differentiate between these two events that have been the thorn in the side of ecologists for you know, as long as we've been trying to answer these questions. So it's really powerful in that sense. But that's where it's key that you have, you know, enough coverage of those sites. You're not losing birds for periods of time just because they're out of sight of antennas. So for most birds, what you see on that middle graph, where you've just got, you know, hundreds of detections on a daily basis, that's what we're aiming for. So you can be really sure when you have these events as to what is actually happening, rather than it just being a problem where the bird moved over the hill and we lost it, if you see what I mean.
That's awesome. Thank you, Nick. That sorry to cut into your lunchtime, but it's really great to hear it from you, as I would not have been able to explain it as well as that.
Great. Thank you so much again to our presenters and our translators and all of you for coming to this webinar. It's a really active question period. We will be posting the recordings on our website. So if you missed anything or want to share this, it'll be available later. And I'll turn it over to you, Paul, if you have any closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Quinn and Elizabeth and Randy, Nick, Sarah, and others who participated and provided such great dialogue to this incredible species. Thank you so much. And thanks in particular to our translator, Berlin. She did I think did a marvelous job. And we are so thankful for her. And if you have any thoughts or comments about the translation, please send them on to me or Quinn at our Road to Recovery email. We'd welcome your comments and suggestions. Our next webinar will be on Friday, March the 8th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Hopefully you all are already registered for it, but if not, please get registered for it. And also just check out our growing website at r2rbirds.org. I think you'll find resources there that will benefit you and your working group and be of interest to you. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating today, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you all.